Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. It's great to be back in the podcast seat as we kick off 2026 and another year of exploring national security issues, giving you an inside look at those issues and maybe some additional insight or perspectives to consider. Today on the podcast, we're kicking things off with one of the hottest topics around the globe, Venezuela. We just so happen to have one of the world's foremost experts on Venezuela, notably regarding resilience and resistance within intrastate conflict, just down the hall, Dr. Rob Burrell, Senior Research Fellow here at GNSI. Also joining us today from the United Arab Emirates is Dr. Homer Harkins, who spent 10 years at the Joint Special Operations University here in Tampa and is currently a military education mentor at the UAE War College. Rob and Homer collaborate on much of their Venezuela work, producing some of the best research and insight on that country's situation. This is actually the second time they've been on the podcast, as they were guests on ATB in September of 2024, also to discuss Venezuela, but a lot has changed since then. Rob Burrell, Homer Harkins, welcome to At the Boundary. Great to have you here today.
Thanks, Jim.
Be here.
Start with you, Homer. U.S. actions in Venezuela, their aftermath, and what the future might hold. It's pretty much dominated the recent news cycle. You two have been tracking events in Venezuela for years, well before it became the Trump administration's and really the media's focus as well. So, Homer, can you describe the background of how this confrontation between the U.S. and Venezuela built up?
I can. My disadvantage is I'm intimately involved, and so I've got to package a lot of information into a short period of time. But I think you have to understand a little history to understand where we are. And I would go back really, it may seem a lot, but 100 years to really when oil began to be a big thing in Venezuela. And you can see that era in kind of three phases, and I would see them as the first phase was the phase of oil exploitation. It lasted about 40 years from 1920 to 1960s. 1960, it was a period of unbelievable socioeconomic growth. I mean, literally, we're talking about going from a very poor Latin American country to, by some accounts, the third wealthiest country in the world per capita income. It was spectacularly successful. The problem was this was done under a military dictatorship. While that military dictatorship actually helped kind of minimize the corruption and such and maximize the growth, it also led to a lot of frustration. And as the country began to prosper, an intelligentsia emerged that really asked, if we're going to be so wealthy and successful, why can't we be part of the first world? I mean, we were stuck in the third world, and this is back in when the first world, second world, third world was a thing. And why we're stuck in this third, to be a first world country, we really need to be a democracy. And a lot of very brave young men put everything they had on the line. Some of them ended up in prison, some of them ended up dead, but they were able to bring democracy to Venezuela. Excuse me. So then you enter the next stage from 1960 to about 2000, where democracy really entered into the country. Now, unfortunately, this also was a period of time where the growth began to become slower. It began to start to stagnate. You could argue why. I do think a lot of the economic decisions that were made may have been a little bit off. There's a lot of they call import substitute economics, where they use the money to kind of to harvest internal manufacturing. It was very kind of inefficient. And as they return to the rule of law, now you've got due process. And if you want to convict somebody for corruption, you got to take them to court, right? You can't. Under the dictatorship, you just make the problem go away. Under this, it became an issue, and I would say that the corruption exploded. So as kind of economic inefficiency layered in with all this corruption, you started to see a lot of social frustration. And it kind of came to a head on the 18th of February, 1983, where the decision was made to let the Bolivar, the currency of Venezuela, float. And overnight, it lost half of its value. Now, that seems nothing to you and me, but imagine if every American lost one half of their value overnight. What the implications of that would be. Now, for us, we would think, okay, we'll bounce back, right? You know, the 2008 meltdown, It didn't bounce back. It went, the Bolivar went from 4.3 Bolivars to the dollar to, by the end of the democratic phase, it was 500 Bolivars to the dollar. So it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. So into this kind of socioeconomic decline steps a figure by the name of Hugo Chavez. And he was a very young, very intelligent, very charismatic army officer, high in his class, recognized for his intellect, who happened to also, by the way, be a dedicated communist. Now, you could be a dedicated communist in Venezuela because it was the rule of law and such, and free speech and free political thought. Now, the military knew about him, and he began to organize this thing called Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario del Ciento. And it was kind of a clandestine organization within the military where he tried to bring in people who were dissatisfied with the way things were going and organize them into a classic political movement, social movement. And he said by the culmination point, he had over 10% of the military who were members of this group. And in 1992, they launched a good old-fashioned military coup. It failed miserably, and unfortunately, about 25 young conscript soldiers were killed, and another 50 were wounded, and many of them crippled for life. But a statement was made, and even though he and his co-conspirators ended up going to prison, and were looking forward to 30 years in prison, follow-on politicians kind of used this as say, well, we understand there are problems in Venezuela. We need to solve these problems. These young men, they meant well. And so overnight, Hugo Chavez goes from a guy looking at 30 years in prison to a Robin Hood figure. And 6 years later, he's out of prison. He's elected the president of Venezuela. And then we kind of entered the third stage, and that was the stage of communism. It started about the year 2000, went to about 2020. And now, at this time, by the devil's luck, or some would say good strategic planning, oil took off. When Chavez took office, oil was $10 a barrel. Within a decade, it was up to $100 a barrel. So there was a lot of money being made by oil, okay? And that's the lifeblood, in some ways, of Venezuela. And so Chavez was able to use this money to do a couple of things. One, to kind of reinstate social programs, to buy loyalty, but he was also able to use it to force the private sector to basically take deals they could not refuse. I mean, they literally were going into companies and saying, we're going to buy your company. Here's the price. Would you like to take it or not? And most of them took the money and left the country. And so dual hat, one, they created all these social programs, spent all the money, and they also collapsed the economy, right? And then, devil luck, Hugo Chavez dies of cancer. And on the way out, he puts in power this guy named Maduro, who was a really hardcore communist, and the money runs out. So now we're kind of at a point where you got really the communists are consolidating power. There's increasing repression, and there's also socioeconomic catastrophe. And it reached the point where people don't realize that between 2017 and 2020, there were actually 3 coup attempts to try to remove the Maduro regime by military officers. And so, but it just couldn't be done. And a lot of this was because Cuba had stepped in, and we saw in the raid the other night that Maduro was protected by communists, or he was by the Cubans. And so this was the apparatus that was keeping them in power. So now I would say, as far as the U.S. reaction to Chavez, first of all, we had great relations with Venezuela throughout the first 2 phases, throughout the period of oil exploitation. It was kind of mutually beneficial. The period of democratization, we were uncomfortable with Chavez being elected, but what we wanted to support the democratic process. So initially, we were very supportive of Chavez initially, but things began to bubble up. There was he was basically forced out of power in 2002 after he'd been in power for about 4 years, kind of a Keystone Cop type scenario. He's back within 3 days, and it kind of turned into a disaster for the opposition. And at that point, Chavez really went in hard with the Cubans. He said, I need your help. I can't pull this off without your help. And you started to see kind of repression digging in and consolidating power. Meanwhile, the oil prices are collapsing. Chavez dies, right? And you started to see kind of a return to mass poverty, because as the oil money ran out and you killed the economy, what do you got left? You got nothing left. And now we reached a point where literally by 2020, we've got failed state. Upwards, some people say a third of Venezuelans have left the country. I mean, that's how bad it is. And and you think most of that third are the people with the brains and the courage to actually make the country work. So what you got left is not, as we say, quality human resource. So I think, again, we, as the repression increased, we started to do selective sanctions, right? Selectively sanctioning individuals. But then in the third phase, really, I think we started to see Chavez consolidate power, Maduro, consolidate power. And then we had the 2024 election where it was obvious that Maduro lost and all the facade of elections went away and Maduro just became a dictator. And now we entered the fourth phase, and that was, we got to get rid of this guy. And that kind of culminated on the 3rd of January with his removal. So I think that's kind of the history, how we got here. I know it's kind of a history lesson, and that's a lot, but you can understand how it went through this kind of phase of success and then this kind of slow demise, and then it fell into catastrophe and dictatorship. And we reached the point where something had to be done, and action was taken.
And action was taken, and really appreciate that, because I think a lot of people who, who have been watching this and have been taking in the recent media reports, they don't know that history. They don't know what's happened in the long term, which could set the conditions so that something like this would make sense as a next follow-on step. So with that history lesson in mind, which is that background in mind, now let's move to the present now. And you spend time on the ground. You understand the military situation in Venezuela better than most. So, while the global public has read and heard a lot about the military option on January 3rd, you could probably provide additional perspectives and even bring to bear some of the actions that have been underreported. If you could talk to that a little bit.
I will try. I will say that I've been out of the service now for 25 years. The technology has advanced immensely. So I'm on the outside looking in with a lot of the stuff that happened. And I do monitor that. I teach at the War College here in the UAE. And so I say try closely monitor this kind of stuff. And I think probably the most impressive part of all of this was the information preparation from a variety of perspectives. First, it seems that somehow we were able to get incredible information on Maduro's pattern of life. We were able to basically determine their access denial architecture and how it worked and to disrupt that. And I think we used some very modern technology to do that. We were somehow able to get a lot of information on where Maduro probably stayed in his residence. There's a little bit of talk about how he moved around. I don't think that's the case. I'm speculating here, but I think he slept in the same place every night, basically because he had multiple rings of security. He figured the most secure place for me to be is right here. And I tried to find the compound that you see in the visuals. It did not exist when I left the country back in 2002. All that is new infrastructure. And so I think it was specifically built to protect the head of state. So he figured that was the place for him to be. Now, when the time came to execute, I think this was kind of, in many ways, our first truly multi-domain special operation, where we use cyber and we use space, we use air, we use to basically disrupt the command and control capability of the Venezuelans. And when we talk about the lack of reaction, I think it's because we so effectively took out the cell phones, we took out the internet, we selectively took out electricity in the zone of action. I do believe there was kinetic strikes. Well, I saw some of the hits. I believe they took out their central command operations center in the Ministry of Defense. So there was some kinetic strike, but cumulatively, they basically blinded the Venezuelans. There was no ability to operationally react. And then when they actually kind of hit the ground and the assault force went in, all they had to worry about was local reaction. We saw, for example, some barracks taken out. It looks like those were where the Cubans slept, the Cuban reaction force. So it was hit hard. So the ability to tactically react was robbed from the very beginning. And then we talked about the infiltration with about a dozen helicopters. They say from the time they hit the ground, I suspect there were maybe 80 operators backed by law enforcement, because it was a legal issue. So you wanted law, and that was probably the hostage rescue team from the FBI. They were within 3 minutes of landing in the helicopters. They were already in Maduro's bedroom. So that's what they say. So they knew exactly where they were going. Yeah. And within 5 minutes, he was on a helicopter with his wife. There was probably some sensitive side exploitation for, computers and that kind of thing. But within 30 minutes, everybody was gone. Excuse me, and they're on the way out of the country. So it was an incredibly successful example of a modern special operations direct action mission.
Yeah, I think from a from a kind of a infiltration raid point of view, the tactics of it appear to be stunningly successful. And I was in my career, I was a special ops guy most in my career on the Air Force side, and I know that the raid in Sante in the decades ago was something that was studied and learned from that for years after that. And I get a sense that this is going to be something they're really going to pull the lessons learned in this new modern way, emphasizing, like you said, all the multi-domain aspects, using space, cyber, all the capabilities they had to, like you said, effectively blind them so they could achieve a level of tactical surprise, even as they strategically built up forces in the region for weeks.
I do think that a lot of the force buildup was diversion. I think it was as we call, FDOs, which were ways of trying to discourage and motivate action. I really believe that Trump wanted the guy to leave the country. We hear reports of him being offered asylum in Russia or whatever. I think that that's what Trump wanted to do. He wanted to get the guy to leave the country. But there are a lot of other reports that the guy just really isn't the brightest bulb in the box. I mean, he's not a smart guy. And I just don't think he realized what he was up against. And I don't think the Cubans wanted him to go. I think that he probably in the back of his mind was wondering what might happen to him if the Cubans realized that he was leaving. So those options were kind of closed off, probably.
Got it. Yeah. Hey, Rob, let's bring you in now. So, looking forward beyond speculation about, the Trump administration's designs for future U.S.-Venezuela relations, what happens inside Venezuela in terms of potential democratic transition? It's a key area of commentary now in the media. What do you see happening from here? What might that democratic transition look like?
It's just going to have to be a little bit of speculation here because it's a very dynamic situation. I think the remaining Chavista regime is split into two main camps right now. The first is Delcy Rodriguez, who is the interim president. She has solidified her support with her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, who is now the president of the National Assembly. So she's trying to hedge her support there, but she doesn't have control over the mechanisms of security. Padrino Lopez is a defense minister still and responsible for the military, and Diosdado Cabello is their interior minister. He is probably the most nefarious of all the characters. He controls the colectivos and has his hands into a lot of illicit activities. But the Rodriguez coalition, Delcy and her brother, do not have bounties on their head, whereas Lopez and Cabello do. And so there's going to be a struggle there between Delcy Rodriguez's ability to move towards open elections or move towards a transition into democracy, where Lopez and Cabello are going to fear that greatly because they're going to pay the consequences once that happens. Delcy Rodriguez is not a popular figure in the country, by the way, and perhaps that will change. But she had a large hand in suppressing voters and suppressing the move towards democracy. But she appears to be making some concessions. She recently agreed to allowing the political the folks that have been detained and put in prison for political reasons. They're going to be released from prison. It's a good move, and we'll see how far it will move forward in this transition. The huge leverage for the United States is the maritime exclusion zone, which they're going to maintain. And the other part of that, that's the stick. The carrot is that Trump recently is talking about $100 billion of investment. So that $100 billion of investment into the oil infrastructure will require a stable and representative regime. It won't come before that because these corporations don't make those type of decisions unless they know their investment has a return. So those are the carrot and sticks that are being used moving forward. I think the long-term solution is Maria Corina Machado and having a representative Democratic government. But how that transition occurs and over what time frame, I think, is still to be determined.
Well, and just in a few hours before we recorded this podcast, President Trump indicated he was looking to meet with Maria Corina Machado, even though previously he kind of showed not as much interest in meeting with her. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Trump is a pragmatist, where a lot of Americans are idealists. So, there are a lot of some of the news channels are already asking. In fact, they were asking Marco Rubio, when's the election's going to happen? And he's like, they just happened in 2024. Like, what do you expect? Like, there's going to be elections tomorrow. Like, this is going to take some time. The current strategy, and I breathed a sigh of relief when Delcy Rodriguez took the helm. And we've lived this for 20 years. When there's a power vacuum, there's a lot of instability that can occur, right? And so who's going to provide physical security and maintain some type of a semblance of calm when Maduro is removed from power? And right now, that's Delcy Rodriguez. And she's been able to work with Padrino Lopez and Diosdado Cabello to maintain control of security in the near term. And that's very important. Maria Corina Machado didn't have those levers. She doesn't have control over the military. She doesn't have control over the colectivos or anyone who has a firearm. She's a nonviolent resistance leader. So she doesn't have those control measures. And so there has to be a transition that occurs.
So what are the most important factors in the next few months to watch for? This can either be from the official administration point of view or also from that of of an American public continue to track developments regarding Venezuela in the media? What do you see as those factors?
I think there's 7 factors, and I hate throwing 7 out there, so people, already are like, "Oh my gosh, this is too complicated." But I think there's 7 factors. One is what are the U.S. demands, and is the regime adhering to them? That's important to consider because things could change. The regime might become entrenched and defy U.S. demands. So that's important. The second is can the administration maintain U.S. domestic support for this intervention? And I think this is probably the most important of all the 7 factors is, does the U.S. domestic audience support U.S. foreign policy in regarding Venezuela? Right now, it's about a third who support what happened, about a third oppose it, and about a third are still trying to figure things out to see what they support and what they don't. And that's probably a fairly good estimate of U.S. domestic support. But is U.S. domestic support going to continue this over the long term? And I think this is going to be over multiple administrations. So it's going to go past the Trump administration. And are we going to continue on this thread to support democratization? You know the word I'm trying to say, in Venezuela.
I got you. I'm with you, Rob. Audience is with you. They're hanging on every word.
The third thing is how are the rival factions in the remaining Chavista regime interacting? I mentioned 2 kind of factions that are currently interacting. There's probably a lot more factors to consider. There are 2,000 generals. That's crazy, but there's 2,000 flag officers within the military because they've all been political assignments to maintain control. How are those folks reacting? And then you have the colectivos, which are these militias on the street. They're the ones who have instill fear in the local population. They have something to lose in democracy, right? Because they're getting money from the regime to maintain that fear. And if that money stops, that stops their bread and butter. So there's something else to look at as these changes occur. The fourth thing is, what is the opposition doing? Right now, Corina Machado is meeting with Trump. It looks like next week. So she's maintaining her connections and support for transition, and also to ensure that support goes towards democratization. She wants to make sure that happens. Edmundo Gonzalez is still in Spain, and so when will Machado or Gonzalez return? Those are big questions and things to really keep an eye on. The fifth is, what is the United Nations going to do? United Nations already had a meeting. They had an emergency council that was called by the monthly president, which was Somalia. And you had, the adversaries of the U.S. show up and chime in, like China and Russia saying, this is against the rule of law. There's a lot of hypocrisy there. That's really just a bit of hypocrisy. And then Cuba had to speak twice. They couldn't have enough to say, and they actually mentioned the oil thing, so that's important to them. But there was not this huge change in the United Nations against the U.S. That didn't occur. And then how the nations in the Western Hemisphere, how did they react? You mentioned that Mexico and Colombia called a meeting of the Organization of American States. It did not work out in their favor. So Mexico, right. Colombia, and Brazil pretty much stood alone. Those are all 3 leftist regimes. They pretty much stood alone while the rest of the American states sided with the administration and sided with taking action to remove a dictator who was destabilizing for the region, and particularly for these countries, with all the transnational criminal activity and having sanctuary in Venezuela. It's making it very difficult to govern for all these smaller states. And so they were very supportive of what happened. And then, the last thing to look at are the non-state actors. You mentioned the FARC and ELN. You've got Tren de Aragua. You've got 2 major Mexican cartels that operate out of Venezuela. How do they react to this? like adept non-state actors, I think they will adeptly move with the situation, right? They may even move out of the region, but Maduro didn't control the hinterlands either. These folks have been operating there for a long time. But do they put up a resistance to a new regime that emerges, or do they just try to stay in a shadow world? That remains to be seen. But there are non-state actors that we should be paying attention to. So those are the 7 factors.
Look, some level of stability is better than no stability whatsoever. So, and it's a long-term thing. People may not want to hear that. But these things don't happen overnight, and recovery doesn't happen overnight either. So, as Homer laid out, it was a 100-year history there. So, action that addresses that is not gonna take effect overnight. We could talk about this for hours. We try to. At the Boundary 10, we try to keep it about a 30 some odd minute podcast. And we're going to stick with that. Now, I will say to the audience listening that these two gentlemen are writing a lot on Substack and in different areas about this topic. I would like to end with one question, and that's for both of you. And that's the fact we stay apolitical here on At the Boundary. But there's no question that the political partisanship, it deeply affects the reporting of current events, as well as the reaction from America. So you have the opportunity. What would you say to people that are seeking to, in a politically unbiased fashion, understand the current situation in Venezuela, the history behind it, and what we can expect in the future? What would you say to them? So, Homer, I'll start with you.
I would say go online and look up a group called Caracas Chronicles. I've been monitoring their information feed for 25 years, and they are Venezuelans. Some of them are expats out of the country for political reasons, but they provide incredible insight into what's actually going on. So I would say, and I don't own stock in Caracas Chronicles, I'm just saying I think they're good. So if you want to know what's going on from a fair and balanced way, look up Caracas Chronicles. And give them a couple of bucks each month, and they'll give you incredible insight into what's actually going on this week.
No, that's excellent. I'll be honest, I haven't heard of them, and that's an excellent lead. And so Caracas Chronicles, maybe we'll find that, and maybe we stick a link in the show notes as well for people listening to this podcast so they can find that. Thank you so much. Rob, what would you say?
Well, I think it's true that the domestic audience in the U.S. Is taking this international issue to energize their base on domestic affairs. That's not unique. Colombia is doing the same thing. They have elections in March. So it's kind of I think it's a shame. As you mentioned, Homer and I have been covering this for a long time. We are firm believers in a free, democratic, and prosperous Venezuela in the future. If you want to pay attention to Venezuela and what Venezuelans think, I would look at Maria Corina Machado's channel on X. She routinely publishes things. And I study resistance. That's what I do. But having a unifying and competent resistance leader like Maria Corina Machado is quite rare. Resistances don't normally emerge with this unifying figure. I mean, she is a real gem, and she's the strength of the opposition. She essentially has all the support of the 9 million Venezuelans in the diaspora. She's got 80% of the support, is what's estimated, of Venezuelans in the country. She's garnered support internationally from the European Union and the United States. She's very inspiring. She inspires me every time I listen to something she has to say. She's amazing. And so I think she gives a real chance of hope. I mean, there's a lot of folks who are, I guess, they've lost hope. They just don't think that this is going to end up well for Venezuela. And I think if you pay attention to Maria Corina Machado, you listen to what she has to say. She's very inspiring, and I think as long as she's around, there is a huge chance here for democracy. I think there's over 50% chance that this will work out really, really well for Venezuela. And so I would hope that every American, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, could unify on that idea that this turns out well for Venezuela. I hope no one's cheering that Venezuela fails so that it supports their narrative on Trump.
I would like to hope for that too. Yeah, but we live in a very politically charged environment. There's no question about that. And Rob, I know that give you an opportunity I know you're not a self-promoter, and I admire that about you, but I'll give you a little opportunity to promote. I know you do a Substack channel that I think you collaborated a lot with Homer on that Substack channel as well. And some of your recent writings have covered that. I want to talk a little bit about that for the audience so they know where to go for that.
Sure, you can check out our Substack, our Resistance newsletter, which is at Robert Burrell Substack. Homer and I have been writing about this for a few years, and I counted them. I think there's like 30 publications we've had on Venezuela. We've got a JSOW interview that will come out next week, the Joint Special Operations University, where I'll talk on YouTube about Venezuela. And so, there's more and exciting news coming out. In fact, I've got a podcast tomorrow as well on Venezuela. But if you look me on LinkedIn, I'll be putting out the different events that happen. Both Homer and I have that podcast tomorrow. So very exciting times, and I really appreciate anyone who pays attention to Venezuela. Because Homer and I have been jumping up and down on the table for a couple of years trying to get people to pay attention. So I hope it keeps the Americans' interest for more than a few minutes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And hopefully the people that have listened here heard the history behind it that Homer walked us through. And that was, that was abbreviated and all the intricacies that go with that. And then also reading some of the, either the Substack articles or other articles the two of these gentlemen have collaborated on will give you a better long-term appreciation of what's happened in that nation, so that it leads to better understanding of what's happening now. Whether, agree or disagree, it's all about understanding. So as things go forward, we can be active members of the discussion for what goes on in Venezuela and the U.S.'s relationship to Venezuela. Rob Burrell, Homer Harkins, I want to really thank you for your time today and really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much for having us.
Special thanks to our guests today, Drs. Rob Burrell and Homer Harkins. Rob's a senior research fellow right here at GNSI, and Homer is a military education mentor at the United Arab Emirates War College in UAE. Rob and Homer write a lot on Venezuela, as well as resilience and resistance and irregular warfare around the globe. And Rob, as we discussed, maintains an excellent Substack channel. We'll post that link in the show notes. Couple other quick notes before we wrap things up today. Check out a new article in the National Interest written by our own Dr. Arman Mahmoodian. There's no doubt that the Trump administration has created unprecedented U.S. foreign policy changes around the globe. Arman's article, What Happens If Donald Trump Bombs Iran, explores whether such a tactic, while weakening the Iranian state's ability to brutally suppress the exploding protests in the country, might provoke broader instability and even more violent crackdowns on the population. Look for a link in the show notes. We're also just a few weeks away from the 2026 St. Petersburg World Affairs Conference, held in February at the USF St. Pete campus. This year's conference is February 10th and 11th and is themed Outer Space, International Collaboration and Competition. Astronaut and St. Pete resident Nicole Scott will provide the keynote address. You can find more information at the conference website, and we'll drop a link in the show notes. Finally, save the date for GNSI Tampa Summit 6. Cracks in the Lamp, Freeing the Nuclear Genie. We'll explore nuclear weapons, proliferation and deterrence, and Golden Dome, as well as nuclear energy for military applications, for example, small nuclear reactors. We'll be ready to announce more details about specific speakers in the next few weeks, but the lineup is shaping up to be a who's who among the world's leading nuclear experts. Tampa Summit 6 is scheduled for March 24th to the 25th at the USF Tampa campus. Pre-register today at the event website. We provided a link in the show notes. Next week on the podcast, we're going to talk with the author of an article published in the recent special edition of GNSI's Journal of Strategic Security. That issue focuses on lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, and the author, Daniel Arms, examines what he believes is the very foundation of the conflict: competing claims to Ukraine's historical legacy. In other words, both Russia and Europe stake claims to Ukraine's history, which is often at odds with what the Ukrainian people have wanted throughout their own history. I'm looking forward to hearing that discussion next week. If you don't want to miss that episode or any other episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. GNSI is creating great insight every day for you on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X as well. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Tell your friends and colleagues as well. We also have a monthly newsletter, which you should sign up for immediately. All this on our website at usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall, just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.